Many organizations today, they're trying to balance innovation with risk mitigation as they speed ahead in their AI development. And here to explore this topic and examine how the principles of SDL, Secure Development Lifecycle, can be adapted for AI systems, let's hear from Preeti Ravindra. Preeti is a senior security engineer of a stealth startup. So please welcome Preeti.
All right. Hello, everyone. I'm Preeti. I'm a senior AI security engineer at a stealth startup. And today I'd like to talk a bit about risk mitigation for AI with Secure Development Lifecycle. A little bit about me. I've been doing AI and security before it became cool. I've worked at different environments. And my specialty is at the intersection of AI and security. I currently work as a product security engineer, helping to secure both models as well as AI-related applications. My job is to help accelerate the adoption of AI in a secure way. In other words, you can think of me as batting for the dev team while being in the security org. You can connect with me on LinkedIn or on Twitter. I'm more active on LinkedIn. I'd love to hear your thoughts and happy to answer questions around this presentation. Before I begin, I just wanted to say that this is a talk catered towards security practitioners as well as data scientists, AI engineers, and is meant to go a little bit into the weeds and not meant as an overview talk. This talk is also mostly focused on generative AI. And what I'm really hoping that you will take away today is the difference between the AI development lifecycle and the software development lifecycle, how to bring in secure development, and how to bring together data scientists as well as security practitioners. So, does anybody feel like this off late? We have a lot of AI users who are like super excited. Everybody wants to be like generative AI users on the bandwagon. And definitely AI solutions add a lot of value. But security is a risk management process, and security is very sensitive to risk. So we have security risk programs. And the generative AI enthusiast could come and tackle down a strong standing security program. AI users and developers are everywhere, and we have about 57.7% of generative AI applications developed in on-prem as well as in the cloud. And most of the concerns seem to be around sharing sensitive data or sharing proprietary data. So today I'll be talking about like the different types of risks, and particularly around the confidentiality, integrity, availability, and the non-repudiation, which is like the CIA triad or the cyan that security practitioners are accustomed to, and how different personas or different flavors of AI users and consumers can impact the risk that we see in a particular organization. So the first one is your AI tool power user. They are people who use AI on a day-to-day basis and mostly consume it in a software manner, which means people use ChatGPT, Claude, Grok, and then if you're a developer, you use IDEs like Cursor, which are completely generative AI based, where generative AI can generate code for you. So these are the common third-party tools that are being used. And you can see how different tools are being used to what extent. The most common concern here is that the risk is associated with exposing data to third-party generated tools. You're also concerned a little bit about what some of these tools produce and how those tools could potentially be used downstream within your own organization or enterprise. But the main concern is the exposure of data. When we think about controls, we mostly think about proactive, reactive, So reactive, you can definitely have some sort of monitoring across checking what kind of API calls are being made with your different security tools. You can have some proactive control measures like data loss prevention, but none of these are necessarily foolproof for generative AI tools. However, you should be thinking about what I call as an enablement control, which is enabling your organization and development teams to use some of these generative AI solutions and tools. And the best way to do this could be to host some of these AI models locally and ensuring that the data stays within the boundary of your organization or your enterprise. So that would be one way of risk mitigation. Now, I was talking about security development lifecycle, but none of these things are related to security development lifecycle because you're not necessarily developing, but you are using some of these tools, and that causes risk. Let's pivot a bit into what it would take to develop or use some of these models locally in your environment. And that's where the security development lifecycle comes into picture, and a systems thinking approach is absolutely necessary. When people think about AI security, the focus automatically goes into the intelligent algorithmic component, which is the AI itself. I love having this picture on the left side, which is kind of a modification of Google's view on how machine learning tech debt happens. And this is something very much similar for large language model or generative AI-based applications. As you can see, the large language model itself is a very small component, and there are so many other things around the large language model that's happening here. And it's critical to understand that the model is one piece of the entire holistic system. We have to think about other components like infrastructure, data, model, and the application itself, which brings about the systems thinking component. Here's an example secure software development lifecycle. This has traditionally worked because the items in green that you see, like the requirements, design, development, testing, and deployment, those are the software development lifecycles. And the white boxes that talk about risk assessment, awareness, threat modeling, all of these are corresponding security activities that happen at each of these stages within the software development lifecycle. As you can notice, we have, during the requirements, doing risk assessment. During the design phase, there's a clear-cut design phase in the software development lifecycle where we can do threat modeling, hypothetical situations, plan for hypothetical impacts, do some sort of a total vulnerability analysis and a risk analysis. And then we could also provide some reference architectures. So there is a clear design phase. And then there's the development phase where software developers go about developing their applications based on the design. And then we test to make sure that it meets the requirements. And then we have deployment. And that's where a lot of the vulnerability management, incident response, and the red teaming exercises typically happen. AI red teaming is very popular now, but typical red teaming assignments, as you can see here, happens towards the end of the life cycle. And it's perhaps not the best risk mitigation strategy. So this prompts us to this question: is there a way to identify risks early on in the AI development lifecycle and address how to manage these risks? Here's an example of the AI development lifecycle. I wanted to call out the key differences here. The problem definition, the development and deployment phases are pretty much the same. So when you hear a lot of folks telling that, oh, everything is stable stakes, there's not a lot of difference, I agree. About 80% is still the same, but there is a small nuance of the 20% of how things change. And that is in the experimentation phase and the monitoring phase. So these are the two new components within the AI development lifecycle, which is kind of different from a traditional software development lifecycle. In software development lifecycle, there's a clear demarcation between the design and the development, whereas the experimentation phase is so iterative, and that experimentation phase itself could be considered a mini development phase, especially for data scientists and AI engineers, because they're constantly iterating through different patterns of prompts, different patterns of data, and different types of models, be it open source or third-party cloud-hosted models, different types of application architectures like RAG applications or agentic architectures, different types of agentic architectures even within the agents, like hierarchical or a single agent, multi-purpose agents. So there is a strong experimentation component here, and that is front and center. The other component is the monitoring component, where the monitoring operations of these applications are slightly different. Because in the case of a traditional typical software, the output is deterministic, whereas in the case of AI, the output tends to be stochastic or probabilistic. So the monitoring of these has to be continuous, consistent, and this involves not just changing of code, but could also involve changing of models and data. So the data could impact the model, and the model could impact the code, which kind of repeats throughout the whole life cycle. So what are the challenges with the AI development lifecycle? And why does it kind of cause some risks early on? It's mostly that developers or AI engineers think of it as experimentation, and they fail to engage the security teams early on, and risks emerge right there in the experimentation phase. Because it's not a strong design phase, a lot of the times there is a miss in engaging the security team early on as part of the risk handling process. And then finally, there's also the drift handling process towards the monitoring. The other aspect is the time difference between doing the experimentation to deployment is very narrow. So if the security teams are not engaged early on, the time difference could make the AI teams or the data scientist teams feel like they're blocked in the security teams. And it's very important to reduce the risk of creating this gap between the AI teams as well as the security teams, and to ensure that the entire process is smooth, which is why we need an integrated secure AI development lifecycle. And the secure AI development lifecycle will definitely help map security activities along the different types of AI and data science development that happens. So for example, the problem definition is where we start on the left. And then as we move on, we can see that it kind of bifurcates. One is when you're actually consuming AI developed and hosted by others. And the other branch is when you're actually building the model itself, like a frontier model, like Llama 3.1. Or a frontier model like Gemini. So there are two different workflows here. The most common workflow is the bottom one, where there's like a data curation component, which could be optional, and model development components, again, could be optional. This was more common in the traditional AI development, but not necessarily when it comes to generative AI. In generative AI, it is very critical to pick the right kind of models and evaluate. So evaluating is very important. As a security team, encourage your data science and AI engineering teams to evaluate as early on, because they will have a better idea of what works and what does not work, and that will help you get involved early on to mitigate the risks. So these are typical, this is a typical integrated secure AI development lifecycle. And if I had to call out and go back to our previous diagram where we had the software development lifecycle and the activities of the security teams mapped out, this is the equivalent for the AI development lifecycle, where we have problem definition. Notice how we're bringing in data and model license review early on in this phase, because it is important to map risk according to the kinds of data that is being used, some of the model licensing, because open source models are all the rage now. It is extremely critical to think about privacy impact assessments early on and give your development teams sufficient time to address those risks, either mitigate it or handle it or accept the risks. The other aspect of the secure AI development lifecycle would be the red teaming, which happens early on, as opposed to post-deployment. It happens early on in the testing phase. And this is not necessarily penetration testing, but even the red teaming activities should happen early on in the testing phase. The other aspect would be doing hardening. And this is something that can be introduced in the development phase, where the hardening components apply to the foundational layers of your AI system. One other thought process would be to create reference architectures for your data science or engineering teams to help them think through what potential risks could be. And mapping these potential risks and what you see as a security engineer could definitely help an AI practitioner address and think through their experimentation or incorporate that in their experimentation. Let's take a look at some of the examples, right, of how to apply the secure development lifecycle and tackle risks early on. So this is where we actually get into the core. So this is your second type of AI user. This person is somebody who likes to build tools for internal usage. Think of it as an example where you're trying to build out a generative AI application that can help find answers about your HR policy or about some of the latest product ideas that are going on in the company. Typically, the usage here is there are different types of applications. Most of the applications tend to be RAG nowadays, which is retrieval augmented generation, versus fine-tuning versus research versus agentic applications. And the common types of models that are hosted are, as you notice, they're all cloud-based services, which means there is still the infrastructure security component, there's still the data security component, there's still the software security component. What really changes here is using the systems thinking and kind of looking at where things interface. So let me give you a quick example of what a RAG application looks like. So this is a RAG application where you have a user who has a question like, what is upcoming for Q3 in terms of the product plan? And then that question gets embedded and it goes to a vector database. And then the vector database will find out what this question actually is and what answer it could, or what this exactly could match based on the knowledge that it already has in a document store. So it will find out the closest or the most similar match, and then it will respond. So the response part is where the LLMs do the actual synthesis, and the input part is also where the LLMs do some synthesis. In this particular use case, if you really think about it, yes, there is a model component that could be attacked. But let's talk about an attack to the data where data confidentiality is compromised. Inadvertent sensitive data is disclosed because the vector database has stored highly confidential docs or highly classified docs. This is a classic attack, and this is a data confidentiality risk. In this case, the mitigation could have been very well applied early on in the design phase, because the security team can recommend what to store in the vector database to draw attention to the right kinds of data policies or the data classification policies, and to implement very fine-grained retrieval or conditional retrievals based on the type of access a particular querying user would have for certain types of data classification. So if an HR person asks for some of these responses, some of the queries around like the upcoming product implementation, there could be a response that is appropriate for their role. Whereas if the CEO asks for a similar response, then there would be a response appropriate for them, because a CEO could have different access compared to a different person or a different employee within the company. This is where it's important to consider engaging teams early on and removing risks very early on in the security development lifecycle. There are a lot of other types of threats that could happen. For example, there are so many data preparation threats. The integrity of the data itself could be tampered if you're ingesting data or documents from third parties. There could be some sort of data poisoning, again, if there is a malicious attacker providing some untrusted input into the document store. And then there could be a lot of vector database related threats itself, such as reverse engineering from embeddings. But those are all like very component-based threats, and then it's really important to look at some of the system-based threats. Now that we have like some sort of an internal application, and we've passed that through the secure development lifecycle, let's go through the next one. The next one here is your AI engineer. They are people who use a lot of AI SDKs to do active development. And the most common or popular AI SDKs that are being used are things like OpenAI SDK, XGBoost, which is like a traditional machine learning model, LangChain, Crew AI. These are all extremely popular ways to interact and orchestrate your large language models. And if you look at the left side, you can see that most teams are still very much in the research or experimentation phase, and not very much so in the development and deployment phase. And the reason for this is that there is a lot of risk around handling external inputs, such as interactions with users. So it's okay to have internal chatbots, but the risk levels just rise up when you're exposing things externally. So think of an example where your AI engineer is trying to build out an application where customers could ask questions and kind of troubleshoot answers for themselves and orchestrate some of the troubleshooting steps. Wouldn't that be awesome? Like reading the documents and orchestrating troubleshooting tests from your own documentation. So this part here is where the external inputs matter a lot. And let's take an example of an agentic application. So when I say agentic application, the LLM is kind of like the brain, and the brain will orchestrate different agents which do different types of thinking and planning. So for example, if the task is, can I auto repair, or like, can I quarantine this particular virus on my computer? And then the user comes to your website, looks it up, and then they find documents on how to do that. But then there would be a specific agent that would plan for it. Okay, first go read the document. Second, identify the steps. Identify the malware, identify the way in which you have to quarantine the malware. So those are the agents. And this is where there's a lot of agency to these agents, and they can have a lot of impact or introduce a lot of high risk into the systems. So the first one is, think about it as the trust boundary between the user and the tools. So in the development phase or in the deployment phase, the security team can actually deploy guardrails to protect against harmful user input. What if the user said, show me the schema of your database? Or what if the user said, or what if the user like links you to another tool which could automatically delete all your data? That is a huge risk. And that is why we need some of the guardrails to protect and filter these inputs or these harmful inputs. And this is one of the ways to secure things during the deployment phase. And during the development phase, what if you had a malicious model itself? It's very common now, it's very popular now, where models that are being stored in Hugging Face or any other third-party libraries get downloaded. Everybody wants to try playing with open source models, but those open source models themselves could have backdoors implanted, and they're not scanned. So any attacker could execute remotely on your computer, and that is a huge risk, which can breach confidentiality, integrity, and availability. And in the development phase, the security team can set up scanners to understand what kind of models are being loaded and recommend the right kind of mitigations, such as using safe tensors and checking the source of the machine learning components. So these are some of the common applications of integrating the security in the AI development lifecycle to reduce risk. So far, we've thought about systems thinking, but now let's think a little bit more about the human AI thinking, especially when it comes to generative AI applications. You as a human, you're constantly interacting with the AI component or the algorithm and the model itself. Now let's think about the component. So the research shows that a lot of open source models are very popular now, and these are the most popular self-hosted models are BERT, Distelbert, it goes on. And these model development process itself is completely different. And a lot of model security, notwithstanding things like model weights, model layers, a lot of model security tends to be model alignment, which is producing the right kind of response given the input. So in its simplest form, alignment can be achieved by giving the right kind of system prompt. Alignment can be achieved by fine-tuning. Alignment can be achieved by training with the right kind of data. So as model developers, we have a lot of responsibilities in tackling model-specific risks. Training data means you'll have to identify the right kind of data sources and make sure that your data does not contain copyrighted information, because the models could replicate the copyrighted information. This definitely happens in the pre-training process or before. And then after some semblance of a model is trained, we have what activities called as post-training. And this is where you're tuning the model to give the right kind of response to the given situation. Another key aspect that you'll have to think about during model alignment is the risks. So there are two types of risks. In the AI community, we call them emergent risks, which are capabilities that you didn't know your model had. You'll have to check for these risks early on in the stage. For example, can your model generate malicious code? Has your model now learned how to be violent? Has your model now learned how to cheat? Has your model now learned surreptitiousness, where it can secretly pretend to obey your instructions, but actually not? So there's a lot of these kinds of risks that come up. Is your model being a sycophant, where it's just trying to appease you like a golden retriever? So those are all the different kinds of risks that come up. And these are risks that will need to be tackled very much in the model development phase. And this is very specific to a single component. Overall, I'd like to say, when you're thinking about AI risks, think about combining systems thinking and human AI thinking. You'll have to look at the bigger picture, and you also have to extremely specifically probe the individual model components. And bring security early on, and do not wait for red teaming activities towards the end. Infrastructure, data, and software security are absolute table stakes. As you saw, a model was one component, so think about the interactions of these different data, infrastructure, and software components with the model, and hone in and zero in on the model itself. And finally, AI testing needs a different type of approach, because the outputs of AI is probabilistic, and model security and risk will have to account for that. It kind of lends itself well, because risk is also a probabilistic score to some extent. So think about risks in a very probabilistic sense, and think about your model outcomes also in a probabilistic sense. And finally, we may be heading towards the evolution where a lot of security engineers may have to mature into doing more AI safety work when it comes to models. So these are my top takeaways for thinking about risks, thinking about how to address and manage risks as part of the development lifecycle, be it models or be it applications. I hope you enjoyed the talk. Thank you.